At 74, Earl McCready sat alone in an empty house, his children scattered by his own stubborn pride. The silence was louder than any argument they'd ever had. When a ruined stone mansion appeared at auction in the frozen Midwest, Earl bought it without really knowing why. With only his donkey Clementine and a lifetime of regrets, he began to rebuild brick by brick. What started as filling empty days became something else. A working ranch rising from ruins, barns filled with purpose, gardens planted in hope. As winter gave way to spring, neighbors started helping. Then came the knock he'd stopped hoping for. Could a man who drove everyone away build something strong enough to bring them home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Earl McCready had spent 52 years working the same patch of Wyoming ground, raising cattle and dusand, 3 children on land that had been in his family for generations. The ranch sat in a valley where the wind came down hard from the mountains, where winter arrived early and stayed late, and where a man learned to be tough, or he didn't last long. He'd learned toughness from his own father, a man of few words and fewer smiles. Earl had carried those lessons forward, believing that hard work and harder truths were what children needed. Love was something you showed through teaching, through making sure they could stand on their own 2 feet when the world knocked them down. At least, that's what he'd told himself for most of his life. His wife Martha had been different. She was the softness in their home, the one who bandaged scraped knees and listened to tearful confessions. She'd grown up in town, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and she'd brought books and music into the ranch house. Earl had loved her for 38 years, even when he didn't understand her gentler ways, even when she told him he was being too hard on the children. Sarah had been there first, born in the spring of 1976, when Earl was 28 and still believed he had all the answers. She'd been a serious child, always watching, always trying to please him. She'd learned to ride before she could read, and Earl had been proud of that. He'd taught her to rope and brand, to fix fence and read weather. When she turned 17 and brought home a boy from town, soft hands, college plans, never done a day's ranch work, Earl had made his opinion clear. "You're too smart to waste yourself on someone who doesn't know which end of a horse to feed," he'd said. Martha had tried to soften it later, but the damage was done. Sarah had married the boy anyway, right after high school, and moved to Colorado. That was 31 years ago. Earl had seen her maybe a dozen times since, and never her husband. There were 2 grandchildren he'd never met, whose names he knew only because Martha had written them in her address book. Thomas came next, 2 years behind Sarah. The boy had been born with his nose in a book, and Earl had never quite known what to do with that. He was gentle like his mother, more interested in ideas than cattle, and Earl had worried the world would chew him up. So he'd pushed harder, tried to make the boy tougher, more practical. When Thomas announced at 20 that he wanted to teach literature instead of taking over the ranch, Earl had called it soft, called it a waste, called it running away from real work. Thomas had left for Oregon and hadn't come back. That was 26 years ago. He'd married a woman Earl had never met, had children Earl had seen only in photographs. Martha kept on the mantle. Sometimes Earl wondered if his son thought about the ranch, about the valley, about the father who'd pushed him away. Rebecca had been the youngest, born when Earl was 35, and should have learned something from the first 2. She'd been wild and bright, full of laughter and questions, the child who'd tested every boundary. Martha had delighted in her. Earl had worried constantly. He'd set strict rules, enforced them strictly, believed that structure would keep her safe. When she'd been accepted to college on the East Coast, she'd begged him to come to graduation. He'd been in the middle of calving season, and he'd told her the cattle couldn't wait. She'd left the next day and hadn't come home for her mother's funeral. That was the one that had hurt Martha most before she died. Rebecca had sent flowers but no daughter, and Martha had cried quietly into her pillow at night, thinking Earl was asleep. He'd heard her, but he hadn't known what to say. Pride had locked his jaw shut. Martha had died 5 years ago, cancer that moved too fast for the doctors to stop. In her last days, she'd asked him to reach out to the children, to apologize, to try. He'd promised he would, he'd meant it when he said it. But after the funeral, sitting alone in the house they'd shared for 38 years, he hadn't known how to begin. The silence had felt safer than the risk of more rejection. The years since had been quiet. He'd sold most of the cattle, keeping just enough to justify still calling it a ranch. His body had started betraying him, knees that ground like rusted hinges, a hip that ached when storms rolled in, hands that couldn't grip the way they used to. He'd gotten a cane, which he hated, and started spending more time sitting than working. The only constant companion was Clementine, a stubborn donkey he'd bought on a whim at an auction 3 years back. She was grey and getting old herself, with a temperament that matched his own. She'd bray at him when he was late with her feed, would nip at his sleeve when she wanted attention, and would stand patient and still when he needed to lean against her solid warmth and just breathe. The house felt bigger every year, rooms that had once echoed with arguments, and laughter now just echoed. He'd started eating dinner standing at the counter because sitting alone at the table felt too much like admitting something he wasn't ready to face. He slept in his chair more often than his bed. The television talked to him in the evenings, and he talked back sometimes, which was a thing he'd never thought he'd do. It was on one of those evenings, at the public library in town where he'd gone to escape the empty house, that he'd seen the listing. He'd been using the computer slowly, hunt and peck typing, that frustrated him, trying to find the website for the feed store. Instead, he'd somehow ended up on a real estate auction site. The mansion had looked like something from a different world. Stone walls, 3 feet thick, tall windows, a tower on one corner. It sat on 40 acres in South Dakota, and the listing called it a historic property in need of extensive renovation. The photos showed collapsed sections of roof, windows empty of glass, floors buckled and broken. Snow had drifted into rooms that must have once been grand. The starting bid was absurdly low. Earl had stared at the screen for a long time, at this broken thing waiting for someone to care about it again. He'd thought about his own house, about the children's empty rooms he couldn't bring himself to change, about Martha's sewing room that still held her half-finished projects. He'd placed a bid, just like that, without thinking it through, without asking anyone's advice. A spite bid, maybe, against the silence of his own life. Or maybe something else, something he couldn't name yet. No one else bid against him. 3 days later, he owned a ruined mansion in a state he'd never visited, on land he'd never seen, for reasons he couldn't explain even to himself. The lawyer who handled the paperwork had been confused. "Mr. McCready, have you actually seen this property in person? The structural damage is—" "I've seen the pictures," Earl had said. "I know what I bought. But at your age, sir, this kind of renovation—" Earl had thanked him curtly and ended the call. At his age, everyone wanted to remind him of his age, as if he might forget he was 74 years old with a bad hip and children who'd rather not know him. He'd spent a week preparing, sold the remaining cattle to a neighbor who'd been after them for years, arranged for someone to check the Wyoming property once a month, loaded his pickup truck with tools and clothes, and a box of Martha's things he hadn't been able to sort through yet, hitched the small trailer for Clementine, who'd looked at him with what might have been skepticism or might have been understanding. With donkeys, it was hard to tell. The drive had taken 2 days. He'd stayed in a motel that first night, lying awake on a mattress that wasn't his, wondering what the hell he was doing. But morning came, and he'd gotten back on the road, Clementine patient in the trailer behind him, the highway, unreeling under his tires. He'd reached the property on a grey afternoon in late February. The mansion sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by bare trees and snow-covered fields. It was worse than the pictures, much worse. Sections of the stone wall had crumbled. The roof was more hole than shingle. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. Earl had sat in his truck for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at what he'd bought. Clementine had shifted in the trailer, a gentle reminder that they were here now, wherever here was. He'd gotten out slowly, hip protesting, and walked a circle around the building. The stone was good underneath the damage, thick, solid, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Someone had built this to last, had meant it to stand for generations. But time and neglect had been working on it, and time was patient. There was one room on the ground floor that still had most of its roof, a corner space that might have been a study once. Earl had cleared out enough debris to make space for his bedroll and a small camp stove. He'd brought Clementine in through what used to be a doorway, and she'd settled into an adjoining space that might have been a mudroom, seeming untroubled by their new accommodations. That first night, lying in his sleeping bag on a floor that was more ice than wood, listening to wind whistle through broken windows and Clementine's steady breathing in the next room, Earl had asked himself again what he was doing here. The answer had come slowly, rising up from some place deeper than thought. He was 74 years old, his children were gone, his wife was dead. The ranch that had been his whole life was sitting empty back in Wyoming. He could go back to it, live out his days in that house full of silence and regret, or he could do this instead. He could take this broken thing and make it whole. He could work with his hands until they bled or stopped working altogether. He could build something, even if the only person who'd ever see it was him and a stubborn donkey. It wouldn't bring Martha back. It wouldn't undo the years of mistakes with his children. But it would be something other than sitting still and waiting for the end. In the morning, he'd started working, not because he had a plan, but because that's what you did. You started. The first full day of real work nearly broke him. Earl had woken with the sun, his back already complaining from the floor, and walked through the mansion in morning light. Without night to soften it, the damage was everywhere. The main hall had a hole in the ceiling big enough to see sky. The grand staircase was missing half its steps. Every window was broken, and bird nests filled the corners. What he'd estimated as months of work now looked like years. He'd started anyway, because starting was the only thing he knew how to do. He'd begun clearing debris from the main hall, broken plaster, rotted wood, shattered glass. Each piece had to be carried out by hand, loaded into the bed of his pickup. His hip screamed at him. His hands, even in work gloves, blistered within an hour. By noon, he'd cleared perhaps 10 feet of floor space. The pile of debris outside had grown to the size of a small car. He'd sat down on a chunk of fallen beam, breathing hard, and looked at what remained. The math was simple and brutal. At this rate, clearing just this one room would take weeks. And this was the least damaged space in the building. He'd sat there for a long time, feeling every one of his 74 years. The cold was working its way into his bones. His hip throbbed with each heartbeat. Clementine watched him from the doorway, chewing thoughtfully on hay he'd put out for her. "What do you think?" he'd asked her. "Am I crazy?" She'd flicked an ear but offered no opinion. Earl had pushed himself up, intending to get back to work, to prove something to himself or to the universe or to nobody in particular. But his legs wouldn't quite hold, and he'd stumbled, caught himself on the truck's tailgate. The jar of the impact sent a wave of pain through his hip that made his vision grey at the edges. He'd lowered himself to sit on the frozen ground instead, leaning against the truck's cold tire, and let himself acknowledge the truth. This was impossible. He was too old, too broken down, too alone. Whatever impulse had brought him here had been foolish. He should sell the place back for whatever he could get, go home to Wyoming, and accept that the silence was all he had left. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it settled over him like a weight, pressing down on his chest until breathing felt difficult. That's when he'd remembered the box. He'd been looking for his good hammer, the one with the rubber grip that was easier on his arthritic hands, and had opened the storage compartment behind the truck's seat. The hammer wasn't there, but Martha's recipe box was. He'd forgotten he'd packed it. The wooden box was small, about the size of a shoebox, with a hinged lid and a tiny brass clasp. Martha had kept it on the kitchen counter for as long as he'd known her. Inside were index cards covered in her neat handwriting recipes she'd collected from her mother, from church friends, from magazines she'd clipped. Earl had lifted it out carefully, the wood smooth under his calloused fingers. He'd opened the clasp. The smell hit him first: old paper, a faint trace of vanilla, something that was purely Martha. The cards were organized by tabs she'd made: main dishes, desserts, breads, preserves. Her handwriting looked up at him from each one, every letter carefully formed. She'd always had beautiful handwriting. He'd pulled out the first card in the main dishes section. "Sunday pot roast," it read. Below, in her script, asterisk, "Earl's favorite. Make sure to brown it well first. He likes the crispy edges." Asterisk. The memory came sharp and sudden. Sunday dinners at the 12th. Big table in their kitchen, the children young, all three of them still at home. Sarah helping her mother peel potatoes. Thomas setting the table with exaggerated care. Rebecca sneaking bites of raw carrot while pretending she wasn't. Martha moving between stove and table, her face flushed from the heat, smiling. And Earl sitting at the head of the table, already starting to make the mistakes he wouldn't recognize until it was too late. "Sarah, straighten up. You'll develop a slouch." "Thomas, men don't fuss over napkin placement. Just put them down." "Rebecca, if you're going to help, help properly. Otherwise, stay out of the way." Martha's smile fading slightly each time. The children's eager faces closing off, degree by degree. The slow accretion of small hurts that would, over years, build into walls too high to climb. Earl had set that card aside, with shaking hands, and pulled another. "Chocolate cake times for birthdays and special occasions. Rebecca loves extra frosting." Asterisk. Rebecca's 16th birthday. She'd wanted a big party, wanted to invite the whole school. Earl had said no, that it was a waste of money, that she should be focusing on her studies instead of frivolous things. Martha had tried to argue, gently, that 16 was special. Earl had been firm. They'd had cake, just the family. Rebecca had smiled and thanked them, but her eyes had been elsewhere, already looking toward the door, toward a life beyond his reach. Another card. "Oatmeal cookies times Thomas's comfort food when he's studying." Asterisk. Thomas at 18, home for summer from his first year of college, trying to tell Earl about the books he was reading, the ideas that excited him. Earl, half listening while reviewing ranch accounts, making a comment about when was the boy going to focus on something practical, the hurt in Thomas's eyes. Martha later telling Earl he needed to listen, really listen. But Earl defending himself, saying someone had to keep the boy grounded in reality. Thomas had gone back to school early that year, said he had work to do, had never really come home again, not in the way that mattered. Earl had pulled card after card, each one a small window into the life he'd had and lost. Martha's mother's biscuit recipe, the one they'd served at their wedding. Beef stew, what Martha made when Earl was sick, the only time he'd let himself be vulnerable. Apple pie, Sarah's first successful pie, age 12. I'm so proud of her. He'd been sitting in the frozen dirt, leaning against his truck, crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere he'd kept locked down for 5 years. The box sat open on his lap, recipes fluttering in the wind. All the dinners he'd ruined with corrections and criticisms. All the moments he could have chosen softness and had chosen hardness instead. All the times Martha had tried to tell him, to show him a different way, and he'd been too stubborn to listen. Sarah, bringing home the boy she loved, looking to Earl for approval and finding only judgment. He'd been trying to protect her, he'd told himself, trying to make sure she didn't throw her life away on someone unworthy. But who had he been to judge? And what had his protection cost her? Thomas, sharing his dreams of teaching, of spending his life with books and ideas. Earl had heard weakness and had tried to toughen him up, had made his son feel that what he loved was somehow less than, had made him feel less than. Rebecca, bright and wild and so much like Martha it had terrified him. So he tried to contain that wildness with rules and strictness, thinking he was keeping her safe. Instead, He'd taught her that her spirit was something to be suppressed, that her father couldn't be trusted with her joy. Martha had known, had tried in her gentle way to turn him toward a softer path, but he'd been too certain of his own rightness, too convinced that his way was the only way. And when she'd gotten sick, when time had started running out, she'd asked him to make it right with the children. He'd promised. But after she'd gone, he'd sat in that empty house and told himself they were better off without him, that his attempts at reconciliation would only cause more damage. Pride, he could see now. Pride dressed up as protection. Pride that had cost him everything that mattered. Earl had sat there until his tears ran dry and the afternoon light started to fade. Clementine had wandered over, had lowered her big head and breathed warm air against his cold cheek. He'd reached up and rested his hand on her neck. The cards had told him something, sitting there in the frozen mud with his wife's handwriting spread around him. They'd told him that Martha had known him better than he'd known himself, had known his favorite foods, his comfort needs, his small vulnerabilities, had written them down carefully, lovingly, planning to feed him for years to come. What had he written down about his children? What had he learned about them that he'd kept and treasured? What had he planned to give them that would nourish them long after he was gone? The mansion loomed behind him, broken and waiting. Earl had gathered the cards carefully, placed them back in the box. He'd looked at the building with different eyes. He couldn't bring Martha back. He couldn't undo 20, 30 years of mistakes, but he could build something here. Not just a building. Anyone with money could hire that done. He could build with his own hands, could pour into this stone and wood all the care he should have given his children, could create a space that said what he'd never learned to say with words: "I was wrong. I'm sorry. There's room here for you." It wouldn't bring them back, probably wouldn't reach them at all. But it would be true, and it would be his, and it would be the opposite of sitting in silence waiting for nothing. Earl had gotten to his feet, hip protesting but holding. He'd put the recipe box back in the truck, gently. Then he'd picked up his shovel and returned to the work. The hole in the ceiling still showed sky. The debris still stretched before him like a mountain. But he'd made a choice, sitting there in the dirt with his wife's recipes. This mansion would become what he'd failed to build with his family, a home open to healing, built with humility instead of pride, built brick by brick, board by board, until his hands gave out or his heart did. He'd started clearing debris again, working until dark swallowed the world. The first month passed in a blur of manual labor and small victories. Earl established a routine that gave shape to his days. Wake with the sun, feed Clementine, make coffee on the camp stove, work until his body demanded rest. Repeat. The work was punishing, but it was also clarifying. When his hands were busy, his mind quieted. He'd started with the basics, making the building weatherproof enough to survive in. He'd patched the worst holes in the roof with tarps and plywood, creating a precarious covering that at least kept snow off the floor. He'd boarded up some of the window openings, leaving a few open for light and air. The space he and Clementine occupied became almost comfortable, or at least survivable. It was during the second week, while clearing debris from what had been the main hall, that Earl made his first real discovery. He'd been pulling away rotted floorboards, expecting to find nothing but more rot underneath, when he'd uncovered something different. The beam was massive, at least 12 inches square, hand-hewn from a single tree. The wood was dark with age but solid, the adze mark still visible where someone had shaped it decades ago. Earl had run his hand along it, feeling the slight irregularities, the evidence of human effort. One beam, then another, then an entire framework hidden beneath the decay. Someone had built this place to last, had chosen good timber and worked it with care, had fitted the pieces together, with mortise and tenon joints that still held firm. The rot and damage were all surface level, the cheap repairs and additions that had come later. But underneath, the bones of the building were sound. Earl had spent the afternoon uncovering more of the framework, carefully removing the damaged wood to reveal the solid structure beneath. It felt like archaeology, like uncovering something valuable that time had tried to bury. Each beam he revealed felt like a promise. This could be saved. This deserved to be saved. That evening, he'd made a decision. He wouldn't just repair this place. He'd restore it properly, preserving what was good and replacing only what was too far gone. The work would take longer, would be harder, but it would be honest work. It would honor what the original builders had done. The decision changed everything. Instead of just covering holes, he started really looking at the building, understanding how it had been put together, what its builders had intended. He started making notes in a small journal he'd found in the truck, sketching out what pieces could be saved, what would need to be replaced. He was absorbed in this work, kneeling on the floor, examining a joint, when he heard the truck approach. Earl had pushed himself to his feet, one hand on his cane, and limped to the empty doorway. A pickup even older than his own was pulling up the drive, mud-splattered and work-worn. A man climbed out late 60s, maybe 70, wearing canvas work pants and a heavy coat. "Afternoon?" The man had called out. "Saw smoke from your stove. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Earl had nodded, wary. "Everything's fine." The man had come closer, stopping a respectful distance away. He'd looked at the mansion, at the piles of debris Earl had accumulated, at the tarps on the roof. "That's quite a project you've got here." "It is. Dale Hutchins, farm about 2 miles down the road." The man had extended his hand. Earl had shaken it. "Earl McCready. You planning to live here while you work on it?" "That's the idea." Dale had nodded slowly, still looking at the building. "That's a hard way to do it. Winter's not done with us yet. Gets cold out here." Earl had bristled slightly. "I'm managing." "I'm sure you are." Dale had been quiet for a moment. "I knew the family that built this place. Long time ago now. The Carlsons. Made their money in lumber, built this as their country house. Beautiful place once. What happened to them? Time happened. Kids moved away. Old folks died. Place has been sitting empty for maybe 20 years, passed between relatives who didn't want it and couldn't sell it." Dale had looked at Earl. "You bought it at auction?" "I did." "You have family? Help coming?" The question had landed like a punch, though Dale's tone had been casual, just making conversation. "No," Earl had said. "Just me." Dale had nodded as if Earl had said something that confirmed a suspicion. "Well, I won't keep you from your work. Just wanted to introduce myself, make sure you knew you had a neighbor if you needed one." "I appreciate it," Earl had said, trying to sound like he meant it, trying not to sound like he was dismissing the man. Dale had turned to go, then stopped. "You know, I've got some plywood sitting in my barn, left over from a roof repair I did last year. You're welcome to it if you need it." Earl's first instinct had been to refuse. He didn't need charity. Didn't need people feeling sorry for him. "I can buy my own materials." "I'm sure you can, but no sense in plywood sitting in my barn when it could be keeping snow off your head." "I'm not using it." Dale's tone had been matter-of-fact, not pitying. Earl had wanted to argue but couldn't find solid ground to argue on. The plywood would be useful. He did need it. And refusing seemed churlish. "That's kind of you," he'd managed. "I'll bring it by tomorrow. Maybe some nails, too, if I've got extras." Dale had climbed back in his truck. "You take care, Earl." Earl had watched him drive away, feeling oddly unsettled. The interaction had been friendly, neighborly, in a way that seemed foreign after years of increasing isolation. Part of him had wanted to call Dale back, to accept the help more gracefully, maybe offer him coffee. The rest of him had wanted to maintain the walls he'd built so carefully. The next morning, Dale had returned with a truck bed full of plywood and 2 boxes of nails. He'd helped Earl unload it, stacking the sheets where they'd stay dry. They'd worked in companionable silence, the kind of wordless cooperation that came from 2 men who understood physical labor. When they'd finished, Earl had made coffee on his camp stove. They'd stood in the cold morning air, breath steaming, drinking from metal cups. "You do good work," Dale had said, looking at the framework Earl had uncovered. taking care to preserve the original structure. Not many would bother. Seems worth preserving. It is. Dale had sipped his coffee. I could come by Saturday. Help with the roofing if you'd like. Goes faster with 2 people. Earl's immediate response had been to refuse. He'd started this alone, intended to finish it alone. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness, like conceding something he wasn't ready to concede. But he'd thought of Martha, of how she would have welcomed Dale's help with genuine warmth, of how she would have invited him for a real meal, would have made a friend instead of just accepting assistance, of how his pride had cost him so much already. Saturday would be good, he'd said. Thank you. Dale had smiled, a small thing that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I'll bring my nail gun. Save wear on your arm. After Dale had left, Earl had stood looking at the plywood, at the evidence of kindness he hadn't asked for and didn't quite know how to accept. Clementine had wandered over, had pushed her nose against his shoulder. I know, he'd told her. I'm not good at this. But maybe, he'd thought, maybe that was something he could learn. Maybe the work of rebuilding this mansion included rebuilding himself, learning to accept help, learning to be part of something larger than his own solitary effort. He'd spent the rest of the day working on the roof, using Dale's plywood to replace the worst sections, creating real shelter for the first time since he'd arrived. The work went better knowing he'd have help on Saturday. The solitude felt less oppressive knowing it was chosen rather than imposed. That night, lying in his sleeping bag with the sound of Clementine's breathing in the next room and the roof solid overhead, Earl had felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Purpose, maybe, or hope in a very small, very fragile form. He'd pulled out Martha's recipe box and selected a card at random. Vegetable soup time, simple and hearty. Good for cold days. Asterisk. Tomorrow, he'd thought, he'd make soup, and on Saturday he'd let Dale help with the roof, and bit by bit, board by board, he'd build this broken place into something whole. Spring came gradually to South Dakota, winter releasing its grip 1 degree at a time. The snow began to melt in earnest by mid-March, revealing the ground beneath, turning the property into a sea of mud. But with the thaw came light, longer days, warmer sun, a sense of possibility. Earl had been clearing debris from what would become the front entrance when his shovel struck something metal. He'd bent down, hip complaining as always, and worked the object free from the mud and rotted wood. A horseshoe, old, rusted, but intact. The kind that had been hand-forged, not factory-made. He'd turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the wear marks where it had been fitted to a hoof and used hard. The memory came unbidden. Rebecca, at 7 years old, finding a horseshoe in the pasture. She'd been so excited, running to show him with her hands muddy and her hair escaping its braids. "Look, Dad, it's lucky. Can we hang it over the door?" He'd been busy with something fence repair, probably, or equipment maintenance. Something that had seemed more important than a child's enthusiasm for a piece of rusted metal. "Horseshoes aren't lucky, Rebecca. That's just a superstition. Put it on the scrap pile." Her face had fallen. Martha had taken the horseshoe later, he remembered now, had cleaned it up and hung it in Rebecca's room, telling her that luck was what you made of things, not what things brought you. Earl had stood there in the spring mud, holding this horseshoe, feeling the weight of that old moment. How much effort would it have taken to share Rebecca's joy? To let her hang the horseshoe, to let her believe in small magic? What had his practicality cost her? He'd carried the horseshoe inside and spent an hour cleaning it, using a wire brush to remove the rust, working carefully. When it was as clean as he could make it, he'd found a nail and hung it above the entrance he was rebuilding. Points up, the way Rebecca had wanted to do it, to hold the luck in. It was a small thing, this battered piece of iron. But looking at it there, catching the afternoon light, Earl had felt like he'd corrected something. Too late, too small, but still true. The next morning, he'd been surprised by another visitor. An older woman, Asian American, perhaps in her mid-70s, had pulled up in a sedan that looked too clean for the muddy road. She'd emerged carrying a covered dish. "Hello," she'd called out. "I'm Helen Chen. I live about a mile east. Dale Hutchins mentioned you were out here working on this old place." Earl had wiped his hands on his jeans and approached. "Earl McCready. That's kind of you. But I made too much," Helen had interrupted smoothly. "Chicken and rice casserole. It'll just go to waste if someone doesn't eat it." She'd held out the bowed dish, her tone brooking no argument. Earl had taken it, the warmth seeping through the towel she'd wrapped it in. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it." "Helen, please, and you're welcome." She'd looked past him at the mansion, her expression unreadable. "I remember when this place was beautiful. The Carlsons used to host garden parties in the summer. Quite the sight. I'm hoping to make it beautiful again. Are you?" It wasn't quite a question. She'd studied him for a moment, and Earl had felt seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and oddly reassuring. "Well, you'll need to keep your strength up. Can't rebuild a mansion on stubbornness alone." He'd almost smiled at that. "No, ma'am. Helen," she'd corrected again. Then, more gently, "Dale says you're doing this alone. That's admirable, but it's also foolish. People around here help each other. You might as well get used to it." Before Earl could formulate a response, she'd returned to her car and driven away, leaving him standing with a warm casserole and the distinct sense that he'd been given a friendly order. That weekend, more neighbors had appeared. A young couple, couldn't have been more than 30, had introduced themselves as the Martins. They'd just bought the farm between Earl's property and Dale's place, were fixing it up themselves. "We heard there was another crazy person trying to restore an old place. The husband," James had said with a grin, "thought we'd come meet a kindred spirit." His wife Lisa had elbowed him. "What he means is, we know how hard it is to do this kind of work. We thought maybe we could help each other out." Earl had tried to demur, to say he was fine on his own, but James had already spotted the barn framework Earl had started. "Oh man, you're taking on the barn too? That's ambitious. Lisa, look at this, he's using traditional joinery. That's beautiful work, Mr. McCready." "Earl," he'd corrected automatically. "Earl, seriously, this is impressive. We've been learning as we go with our place, but you clearly know what you're doing." Earl had felt a flush of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride, but the good kind. Not the stubborn pride that had driven his children away, but the honest pleasure of having his work recognized and appreciated. They'd spent the afternoon together, Earl showing them the framework he'd uncovered, explaining how the original builders had fitted the beams. The Martins had asked questions, good questions, and Earl had found himself teaching, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over 50 years of ranch work. It had felt good. It had felt like something Martha would have approved of. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Dale would stop by most Saturdays, bringing tools or materials, helping with the heavy work that Earl struggled with alone. Helen would appear midweek with food, always claiming she'd made too much, always timing it perfectly for when Earl's own supplies were running low. The Martins would come on Sundays, eager to learn and surprisingly skilled with their hands. Earl had resisted at first, uncomfortable with what felt like charity, like pity. But Helen had been blunt with him one afternoon, catching him trying to wave off her offer of help repairing windows. "Earl McCready," she'd said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Pride is what keeps a man warm at night when he's sleeping alone. But it's a cold comfort, and it doesn't fix windows. We're not offering help because we feel sorry for you. We're offering because that's what neighbors do, and because this building deserves to be saved, and because maybe we all need a project bigger than ourselves to work on." She'd held his gaze until he'd nodded, accepting. "Good," she'd said, her tone softening. "Now, I have 3 grandchildren who need something useful to do this summer. How do you feel about teaching a couple of teenage boys about carpentry?" Earl had thought about Rebecca, about Thomas, about Sarah, all the things he could have taught them and hadn't. "I'd be honored," he'd said quietly. The community that formed around the mansion's restoration surprised Earl. It wasn't something he'd sought or expected, but it grew organically, each person drawn by their own reasons. Dale, recently widowed, seemed to need the project as much as Earl did. Helen, whose children lived states away, had energy and competence to spare. The Martins, young and ambitious, saw Earl as a mentor and the mansion as a shared vision of what old things could become. For the first time since Martha's death, Earl felt connected to something beyond his own solitary grief. The work was still hard, his body still complained, but now there were other hands to share the load, other voices to fill the silence. One evening, finishing up a day of work on the barn, Earl had stood back with Dale and James, looking at what they'd accomplished. The frame was up, solid and true, waiting for walls and a roof. "This is going to be something," James had said. Dale had nodded. "Already is something." Earl had looked at the horseshoe hanging above the mansion's entrance, catching the late sun. Maybe there was such a thing as luck after all. Or maybe, he was starting to think, luck was just what happened when you stopped pushing help away and started letting people in. That night, he'd written the first real letter to Sarah, not the crumpled, unsent attempts, but actual words he intended to mail. He'd told her about the mansion, about the work, about the community forming around it. He'd told her he was sorry, not just for one thing, but for all of it, for every time he'd chosen his version of right over her need for acceptance. He'd sealed the envelope before he could second-guess himself. Tomorrow, he'd mail it. Whether she responded or not, he'd have tried. And trying, he was learning, mattered more than succeeding. Summer arrived in a rush of green. The mud dried into workable earth. The trees that surrounded the property leafed out, providing shade that made the afternoon work bearable. Earl had lived through 4 months at the mansion now, and the change was visible everywhere. The barn stood complete, its frame filled in with new walls and a roof that didn't leak. Earl had spent weeks on the doors, fitting them with the same care the original builders had used on the mansion itself. Inside, Clementine had a proper stall, and there was room for tools, for supplies, for all the materials that kept accumulating as the work progressed. The mansion itself was taking shape more slowly, but more surely. The roof was sound now, all of it, not just patched, but properly repaired. Windows were going in, not the originals, which were too far gone, but new ones, sized to fit the old openings. The main hall had been cleared entirely, its beautiful hand-hewn beams exposed and cleaned, the floor rebuilt on the solid foundation underneath. It was during the window installation that Earl had found the photograph. He'd been cleaning out his wallet, looking for the hardware store receipt, when it had fallen out, a picture he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. 3 children, young and smiling. Sarah couldn't have been more than 12, which would make Thomas 10 and Rebecca 7. They were standing in front of the old ranch house, squinting into the sun. Sarah had her arms around her younger siblings, protective already. Thomas was grinning, gap-toothed. Rebecca was mid-laugh at something off-camera. Earl had stared at it for a long time, these children who'd grown into adults he barely knew. When had he last really looked at this picture? When had he last remembered them as they'd been young and open and still believing he was someone worth looking up to? He'd taken the photo inside, pinned it to the wall of the bedroom he'd finished for himself on the first floor. Every morning when he woke, he saw it. Every evening, before sleep, it looked back at him, a reminder of what he'd had, what he'd lost, what he was hoping, however futilely, to somehow find again. Dale had noticed it one Saturday, had stood looking at it for a moment. "Your kids?" "Yeah. They know about this place, about what you're building?" Earl had hesitated. "I wrote to one of them. My daughter Sarah. Haven't heard back." Dale had nodded slowly. "Sometimes people need time to trust that change is real. Sometimes they don't care that it is. Maybe," Dale had turned from the photo, "or maybe they're like you were a few months ago, not sure how to accept something being offered, not sure if it's safe to hope." The observation had stuck with Earl, working its way under his skin. Was that what he'd done to his children? made them afraid to hope that he could be different? The near accident came a week later. Earl had been working on the second floor, replacing boards in what would become Sarah's room if she ever saw it. He'd set up a ladder to reach the high window frames, and he'd been balancing on the top rung, which he knew better than to do, had warned others never to do, when the ladder had shifted. Everything slowed down in that terrible way time has when disaster looms, the ladder sliding sideways on the smooth floor, Earl's hands grabbing for the window frame and missing. The sickening tilt, the certainty of falling, the knowledge that at 74 a fall from this height could mean the end of everything. Then Dale's hands were there, catching the ladder, bracing it. "I've got it. Don't move." Earl had frozen, heart hammering, knuckles white on the rung. Slowly, carefully, he'd climbed down. When his feet hit solid floor, his knees had given out. He'd sat down hard, breathing like he'd run a mile. "What the hell were you thinking?" Dale's voice had been sharp with fear turned to anger. "Top rung? On a smooth floor? You know better than that." "I know. It was right there. I thought I could." "You thought wrong. Jesus, Earl, you could have broken your neck." Helen had appeared in the doorway, drawn by Dale's raised voice. She'd taken one look at Earl's pale face and Dale's shaking hands and put the pieces together. "What happened?" "Nothing," Earl had started to say, but Dale had cut him off. "He nearly killed himself being stubborn, that's what happened." Helen had crouched down beside Earl with surprising agility for her age. Her hands were gentle but thorough, checking his head, his ribs, pressing carefully. "Bruised," she'd pronounced finally. "You'll be sore tomorrow, but nothing broken." "Lucky man." "Lucky Dale was here," Earl had admitted quietly. They'd helped him down to his bedroom, Helen insisting he rest. The bruising had bloomed over the next few hours, angry purple-black marks across his ribs where he'd caught himself on the ladder. Every breath hurt, moving hurt. He'd been forced to sit still for the first time in months. And sitting still meant watching as Dale and the Martins kept the work going without him. Watching as Helen organized the effort, directing teenagers whose names Earl was just learning, her grandsons, eager boys who listened to instruction and worked hard. Watching as decisions were made without his input, as problems were solved by other hands. It had been deeply uncomfortable at first. The work was his, the vision was his, the mansion was his project. But watching from his chair by the window, he'd begun to see something different. James Martin had a better eye for level than Earl did. One of Helen's grandsons, quiet 17-year-old David, turned out to have a gift for the detailed work, the trim, the finish carpentry that required patience and precision. Lisa Martin was faster with power tools than any of them, her cuts clean and sure. They didn't need Earl to direct every moment. They'd learned from him, had absorbed his vision, and now they were making it real with their own skills and insights. Dale had caught him watching one afternoon, had brought him water and aspirin for the pain. "You've built something good here," Dale had said. "Not just the building. This people working together, creating something that matters. That's rare." "I didn't mean to build that," Earl had admitted. "I came here to be alone." "I know. But sometimes what we need and what we think we want are different things." Dale had looked out at the work in progress. "My wife used to say that life was best lived in community. I didn't understand what she meant until after she was gone. Being alone, it feels safer, doesn't it? Can't lose people if you don't have people, but it's also not really living." Earl had thought about his house in Wyoming, about the years he'd spent there in silence after Martha died, about how he'd convinced himself he was protecting himself from more pain by staying isolated. "I've been alone a long time," he'd said. "You're not alone now." The simple truth of it had settled over Earl like a blanket. He wasn't alone. Somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, he'd built a community. People who showed up because they cared, who worked because they believed in what was being created, who stayed because they'd become, in some strange way, family. That evening, recovered enough to move carefully, Earl had gone out to the work site. The crew had stopped for the day, but evidence of their labor was everywhere. The second floor was taking shape, walls going up, rooms becoming defined. He'd stood in what would be Sarah's room, the one with the southwestern colors he'd chosen because his daughter had loved sunsets. James and Lisa had finished the window frames he'd been reaching for when he fell. They were perfect, fitted precisely, ready for glass. Earl had run his hand along the smooth wood, imagining Sarah standing here, looking out at the land. Would she ever see it? Would any of his children? He didn't know, might, never know. But he realized, standing there in the golden light of summer evening, that it didn't matter as much as he'd thought. He was building this place because it needed building, because he needed to build it, because somewhere along the way it had stopped being about earning forgiveness and started being about creating something good, something true, something that would stand as evidence that people could change, could do better, could build beauty from ruins. And if his children never saw it, at least he would know he'd tried. At least he would have done the work. Early autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and rust. The air carried a crispness that made the work easier, the heat of summer giving way to comfortable temperatures. The mansion and barn stood transformed now, recognizable as what they were meant to be rather than ruins waiting for demolition. Earl had been going through Martha's recipe box again, looking for her chicken soup recipe. The weather was turning cold enough to want it when he'd noticed a card sticking out at an odd angle. He'd pulled it out, expecting another recipe, and instead found a folded piece of paper he'd never seen before. The paper was thick, the kind children used in elementary school for art projects. It had been folded carefully, preserved between the recipe cards. Earl had opened it with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. A house. Drawn in crayon by a child's hand, the colors still bright after decades. It was simple. A rectangle with a triangle roof, windows with curtains, a door with a round knob, flowers in front, a sun with radiating lines in the corner, and across the top, in careful wobbling letters, Our Family. Beneath the house, stick figures. A tall one labeled Dad in blue crayon, a slightly shorter one labeled Mom in purple. 3 smaller ones, Sarah, Thomas, Rebecca, each in different colors, all holding hands in a line, all with round, smiling faces. Earl had turned the prosod, paper over. On the back, in Martha's handwriting, Sarah, age 6, said she wanted to draw our house. Isn't it perfect? The memory came back fully now. Sarah at the kitchen table after school, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, selecting each crayon with great care. Martha at the stove, glancing over, praising the work. And Earl, where had he been? Coming in from outside, probably, looking at the drawing briefly, saying something like, "That's nice, honey," before moving on to whatever seemed more important. He hadn't known Martha had saved it. Hadn't known she'd tucked it into her recipe box, this precious document of their daughter's vision of family, a vision of everyone together, everyone happy, everyone holding hands. Sarah had drawn what she'd wanted, what she'd believed they had. And Earl had spent the next 43 years proving that her drawing was more hope than reality. He'd sat down heavily in the chair he'd built for the kitchen. The drawing lay on the table in front of him, its cheerful colors a rebuke to everything he'd let slip away. The stick figure labeled Dad smiled up at him, holding hands with the rest of the family, part of the chain. That's when Earl had broken. Not the angry tears he'd shed over the pot roast recipe. This was something deeper, something that came from a place he'd kept locked down his entire life. Great, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, the grief of understanding, finally, what he'd lost. Not just his wife, not just his children's presence, but the simple dream his 6-year-old daughter had drawn a family together and smiling. He'd wanted that too. Had wanted it desperately and hadn't known how to build it. Had thought that being strong meant being hard, that teaching meant criticizing, that love meant preparing children for a harsh world rather than giving them a soft place to land. He'd thought he was building something sturdy, when all along he'd been building walls. Clementine had wandered into the kitchen, had pressed her warm nose against his shoulder. He'd wrapped an arm around her neck and cried into her dusty coat until the storm passed. When he'd finally been able to breathe normally again, when the tears had dried on his face, Earl had looked at the drawing with new eyes. Sarah had drawn a house. Not the ranch house they'd actually lived in, but a generic house, a symbol. She hadn't drawn the barn or the cattle or any of the things Earl had thought defined their lives. She'd drawn a house, a home, and a family holding hands. That's what she'd wanted. That's what they'd all wanted. And this mansion, this broken place he'd been rebuilding, could be that. Could be the home Sarah had drawn, even if she'd drawn it 43 years too soon. Earl had stood up, his decision crystallizing. He'd been writing to Sarah, drafting and redrafting, never quite getting it right. But the problem was, he'd been trying to justify himself, to explain his choices, to make her understand. What he needed to do was simpler and harder. Apologize. Truly, completely, without excuses. He'd gotten paper from his room, good paper, not notebook scraps, and sat down at the kitchen table. The table he'd built himself, solid and true, and he'd written, Asterisk, dear Sarah, asterisk he'd begun, and then the words had flowed. He'd told her about the drawing, about finding it in her mother's recipe box. He'd told her that he finally understood what she'd wanted, what he'd failed to give. He'd apologized not for one thing, but for the pattern of things, for the ways he'd made her feel small instead of celebrated, for choosing his version of right over her need for acceptance. He'd told her about the mansion, about the work he was doing, but not to impress her or prove he'd changed, just to share what his days looked like, the way a father should share with a daughter. He'd told her about Clementine, about Dale and Helen and the Martins, about learning to accept help. He'd told her he loved her, that he'd always loved her, even when he'd been terrible at showing it. He'd told her he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect her to respond, but that he wanted her to know he was sorry, and that if she ever wanted to see what he was building, there was a room here with her name on it. When he'd finished, he'd started another letter. Asterisk, dear Thomas, asterisk. The same honesty, the same apology, but different in the details, because Thomas's wounds were different. The ways Earl had dismissed his gentle nature, his love of books and ideas, his choice to teach instead of ranch. The ways Earl had made him feel that who he was wasn't enough. Then a third letter, asterisk, dear Rebecca, asterisk. The wildness he'd tried to contain, the laughter he'd tried to moderate, the spirit he'd seen as something to be tamed rather than treasured. The graduation he'd missed, the priorities he'd gotten so wrong. By the time he'd finished all 3 letters, evening had fallen. His hand ached from writing. His eyes were gritty with dried tears. But he felt lighter somehow, emptied out and refilled with something that might have been hope. The next morning, he'd driven into town and mailed all 3 letters. Standing at the post office counter, watching the clerk take them, Earl had felt his hands shake slightly. These letters were bridges thrown across decades of silence. They might land on the other side or fall into the void, but he'd thrown them, and that mattered. Dale had helped him start building the fence that afternoon, marking out the boundaries of the property with posts and wire. Good fence building required patience and precision, and Earl found the work soothing after the emotional intensity of the letters. You seem different today, Dale had observed, tamping down earth around a post. Lighter, maybe. Wrote to your kids? Earl had looked at his friend in surprise. Dale had smiled slightly. Seen that look before, in the mirror, after I finally called my brother. Took me 10 years to do it. You're braver than I was, or more desperate. Maybe the same thing sometimes. Dale had straightened, looking at the line of fence posts marching across the property. This is good work, Earl. All of it, the building, the letters, the trying. Martha would be proud. Earl had thought of the drawing, of Sarah's careful crayon lines. I hope so, he'd said quietly. That night, he'd pinned the drawing to the wall next to the photograph of his children. 2 visions of family. One real, one imagined. Somewhere between them, Earl was building a third vision, a home open to healing, built on humility instead of pride. The first frost came the next morning, touching the grass with white. Winter was coming again, his second winter in this place. But this time the mansion had solid walls, a good roof, warmth inside. This time Earl had people who'd check on him, who'd help if the snow got too deep or the work too hard. This time he wasn't alone. And, somewhere out there, 3 letters were making their way toward his children. What they'd do with them, he couldn't know. But he'd done what he should have done years ago. He'd told the truth, admitted his failures, and offered what he had to give. Now came the hardest part: waiting. But Earl was learning patience, learning that some things couldn't be rushed, that healing took time, that hope was something you held loosely and with humility. He'd learned a lot in this broken mansion. Now he'd see if he'd learned enough. 3 weeks passed, with no response. Earl tried not to watch for the mail truck, tried not to feel the weight of disappointment each day that passed with no word. He kept working, kept building, kept moving forward, because that's what you did. You couldn't control how other people responded. You could only control what you did with your hands and your time. Helen had noticed his tension, the way he'd glanced toward the road whenever a vehicle passed. She hadn't said anything directly, just brought food more often, stayed longer, filled the silence with stories about her own children and grandchildren. Dale had been the same way, showing up with projects that kept Earl's hands busy and his mind occupied. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October. Earl had been working on trim in Rebecca's room, the one with the east-facing windows to catch the morning sun, when he'd heard the mail truck on the road. He'd forced himself to finish the piece he was cutting before going outside, forced himself not to run. The envelope sat in his mailbox, white against the dark metal interior. His name and address in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. The return address made his breath catch: Thomas McCready, Portland, Oregon. Earl had stood there by the mailbox, holding the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid it would be rejection, or anger, or cool politeness that was worse than either. His hands had shaken as he'd torn it open. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on what looked like good stationery. Earl had to sit down on the porch steps to read it. Asterisk, Dear Dad, asterisk, asterisk, I got your letter. So did Sarah and Rebecca. Yes, we're in contact with each other. Have been for the last 4 years, since Mom's funeral brought us all together. I know it probably hurts to learn that we found our way back to each other, but not to you. I'm sorry. It wasn't meant to hurt you. We were just trying to figure out how to be siblings again, after so long. Asterisk. Earl had to stop reading for a moment, the words blurring. His children had found each other, without him. The pain of that competed with a fierce gladness that they were family to each other, even if not to him. Asterisk, Mom wrote to each of us before she died. Asterisk, the letter continued. Asterisk, I don't know if you knew that. She asked us to take care of each other, to not let her death be another thing that separated us. She asked us to give you time to grieve, to give you space to reach out when you were ready. She believed you would, eventually, that you'd find your way to us. She had more faith than I did. Asterisk, asterisk, I won't lie to you, Dad. Your letter was hard to read. Not because you said anything wrong, you said everything right, actually. It was hard because I wanted to read it 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I wanted the father who wrote that letter to be the father who raised me. And I'm angry that I'm only getting to know him now, when I'm almost 50 years old and my kids are already in college. Asterisk, asterisk. But I'm also grateful. Better late than never sounds like a cliché, but maybe clichés become clichés because they're true. Asterisk. Earl had wiped his eyes, kept reading. Asterisk. Here's the thing, Dad. We already knew about the mansion. We've known for about 6 months. Asterisk, asterisk. Dale Hutchins tracked down Sarah through some mutual connection. Apparently his late wife knew someone who knew someone. He didn't ask you first, didn't tell you he was doing it. He just reached out and told her what you were doing. Sent pictures. kept sending updates. Asterisk, asterisk. Sarah contacted me and Rebecca. We've been getting photos every few weeks. Pictures of you working, of the mansion being rebuilt, of you teaching Helen's grandsons carpentry. We've watched you change, Dad. Watched you learn to accept help, watched you build something beautiful, watched you become someone we didn't quite recognize. Asterisk, asterisk. We've been planning to visit. Not to surprise you exactly, but we weren't sure when would be right, how to approach it. Then your letters came, and we figured the timing was as good as it would get. Asterisk, asterisk. So here's what I'm writing to tell you. We're coming, all three of us. Sarah and her husband Mark, Rebecca and her daughter Clara, your granddaughter who you've never met, who's 9 years old and smart as a whip, and me and my wife Karen, though our kids are staying here because they've got school and jobs. Asterisk, asterisk. We're planning to arrive on November 14th. That's 2 weeks from when this letter should reach you. Sarah tried to call, but apparently you don't have a phone at the mansion yet. She left a message on your Wyoming voicemail, but I'm guessing you're not checking that. Asterisk, asterisk. I need you to understand something, Dad. We're not coming to forgive you. We're not coming to have a tearful reunion and pretend the past didn't happen. We're coming because Sarah drew a picture when she was 6 of a family holding hands, and Mom saved it in her recipe box, and you wrote about it like it broke your heart. And maybe it broke our hearts too, realizing that you finally understood what we wanted all along. Asterisk, asterisk. We're coming to see if the change is real, to see if the man who wrote those letters is the same man who'll answer the door. We're coming with hope, but also with caution, because we've been hurt before, and we're not interested in being hurt again. Asterisk, asterisk. But we're coming. Asterisk, asterisk. Karen thinks I should end the letter there, but I need to say one more thing. When Mom was dying, she told me that you were the strongest man she'd ever known, but that your strength was also your weakness. You were so determined to be strong that you couldn't be soft, couldn't be vulnerable, couldn't admit when you were wrong. She said she hoped you'd learn that real strength was in being able to bend, not just in being able to stand firm. Asterisk, asterisk, from the pictures Dale sent, from the letters you wrote. It seems like maybe you're learning that. I hope so, Dad. For all our sakes. Asterisk, asterisk. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Asterisk, asterisk. Thomas Times Earl had sat on the porch steps for a long time after reading the letter. The sun moved across the sky. Clementine wandered over and nuzzled his shoulder. He'd read the letter 3 more times, making sure he'd understood correctly. They were coming, all 3 of them, in 2 weeks. Dale had contacted them, had been sending pictures, sending updates, building a bridge without Earl even knowing. Earl's first instinct was to feel betrayed, to be angry at the pretension, interference. But sitting there with Thomas's letter in his hands, he couldn't find the anger. Dale had done what Earl couldn't do himself, had reached out, had taken the risk, had started the conversation, and Martha had written to them. Before she died, she'd tried one more time to bring her family together. She'd believed Earl would reach out eventually. Even dying, she'd had faith in him. The thought made him cry again. But these tears were different. Not grief alone, but a mixture of grief and gratitude and terror and hope, all tangled together. They were coming. They'd been watching him change. They knew about the mansion, about the work, about who he was becoming. They weren't coming to forgive him. They were coming to see if the change was real. Earl had stood up, his decision made. He had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to finish the bedrooms, to make sure everything was ready, to prepare to meet the strangers his children had become and the family members he'd never met, Mark, Karen, Clara. A granddaughter, 9 years old. He'd missed her entire life. He'd walked into the mansion and looked around with new eyes. The main hall was beautiful now, the beams gleaming, the floor solid. The kitchen was functional, warm. But the bedrooms, he'd been working on them slowly, carefully. They needed to be finished. Needed to be perfect. Dale's truck had pulled up an hour later. He'd found Earl measuring Sarah's room for curtains, making notes. "You got mail," Dale had observed. "You contacted my children." Earl had said it flatly, not accusing but not quite forgiving either. Dale had been quiet for a moment. "I did. Wasn't sure if I should tell you, but figured you'd find out eventually. You angry?" "I should be." "But you're not." Earl had turned to face his friend. "They're coming. In 2 weeks. All of them." Dale had smiled, a slow thing that lit up his weathered face. "Good. That's real good, Earl. I'm terrified. Of course you are. That's how you—" "No, it matters." Dale had looked around the room. "What do you need? What can I do?" And that's when Earl had understood what Thomas meant about real strength. Real strength was being able to say, "I can't do this alone. I need help." "Everything," Earl had said. "I need to finish these rooms, need to make this place ready, need to— I don't know. I need it to be right." Dale had nodded. "Then let's get to work. And Earl, they're already proud of you. They've been watching you build this place for months. The rooms are just rooms. What matters is you'll be here to open the door." 2 weeks. Earl had 2 weeks to prepare for the most important moment of his life since Martha's funeral. 2 weeks to finish the work he'd started 8 months ago. 2 weeks to get ready to meet his children again, to meet the family he'd never known, to see if he'd changed enough, if he'd learned enough, if there was still a chance to build the home Sarah had drawn so long ago. He'd looked at Dale, at the friend who'd risked rejection to help him, and said the 2 words he was learning to say more easily: "Thank you." Then they'd gotten to work. The news spread through the small community like ripples in a pond. Earl hadn't meant to tell everyone, but Dale had mentioned it to Helen, and Helen had told the Martins, and within a day everyone knew. Earl's children were coming. The mansion needed to be ready. What followed was a mobilization that humbled Earl beyond words. People showed up with supplies, with time, with skills he didn't have. Helen arrived with fabric for curtains, already measured and cut from the photos Dale had sent her. The Martins brought their expertise with finishing work. Helen's grandsons came after school every day, eager to help. But the dining table was something Earl needed to build himself. He'd been thinking about it since Thomas's letter arrived. A family gathered around a table was more than just people eating together. It was a symbol, a ritual, a physical manifestation of connection. The table mattered. It had to be right. He'd started with the wood. Not new lumber, but planks he'd salvaged from the mansion itself. Flooring from a room too damaged to save, beams that had been replaced with modern equivalents. Each piece carried the history of the building, bore the marks of the original craftsman who'd built this place. Earl had spent hours selecting the wood, examining each plank for soundness, for beauty, for the story it would tell. Oak, mostly, rich and dark with age. Some pieces had nail holes from previous uses. Some showed the scars of water damage along their edges. All of it was real, was true, was honest about what it had been and what it was becoming. The design he'd sketched out was simple but sturdy. A long rectangle, 8 feet by 4 feet. Big enough for 8 people, 3 children, their spouses, Clara, Dale, Helen, and himself. Room for everyone, room for the family he hoped might gather here, even if, just this once. He'd worked on it in the barn, in the space where Clementine watched him with patient interest. The joining was traditional mortise and tenon, the same technique the original builders had used. No screws, no modern shortcuts, just wood fitting into wood, held by precision and patience. His hands remembered this work from 50 years of ranch repairs, of building things meant to last. But there was something different about this project. Every cut mattered more. Every joint needed to be tighter. This wasn't a fence post or a barn door. This was a table where his family might sit, where conversations might happen, where healing might begin. Dale stopped by every day to check on the progress, to offer a hand with the heavy lifting. He didn't say much, just helped when asked, and watched when not needed. But his presence steadied Earl, reminded him he wasn't doing this alone. "You're making it too perfect," Dale had said one afternoon, watching Earl sand the same section of wood for the third time. "They're not coming to see a perfect table. They're coming to see you. I know, but you want to give them something perfect because you can't make the past perfect." Dale had nodded. "I understand. Just don't forget that perfect isn't the point. Real is the point." Earl had stopped sanding, had looked at the table taking shape. Dale was right. The beauty of this table wasn't in its perfection. It was in its honesty. Wood that had been broken, repurposed, made useful again. Like Earl himself, maybe. He'd left some of the imperfections, the nail holes, the water stains, the marks of time and use. They were part of the story. While Earl worked on the table, the rest of the house came together around him. Sarah's room received southwestern colors, warm terracottas and deep blues that Helen and Lisa Martin painted with care. They'd hung the curtains Helen made, heavy fabric that would keep out the cold, and placed a reading chair by the window. Thomas's room gained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that James Martin had built, each shelf carefully leveled and secured. Earl had ordered books to fill them, classics he remembered Thomas reading as a boy, new titles Dale had helped him select from the bookstore in town. A statement, "I see what you love. I value it." Rebecca's room was all morning light, the east-facing windows hung with sheer curtains that would glow with sunrise. Earl had found a vintage vanity at an antique store, had refinished it himself. On it, he'd placed a framed copy of Sarah's childhood drawing, a reminder of the family she'd wanted, the vision her little sister had been too young to draw, but had surely shared. For Clara, the granddaughter he'd never met, he'd prepared a smaller room next to Rebecca's. He'd consulted with Helen about what a 9-year-old girl might like. The walls were painted a soft green, and there was a window seat with cushions, a small desk for homework, shelves waiting for whatever books and treasures a child might bring. It was Helen who'd suggested he add personal touches, small things that showed he'd thought about them. For Sarah, he'd framed her college diploma that Martha had saved. For Thomas, a first edition of a book he'd mentioned loving in one of his childhood letters home. For Rebecca, a photo of her at her graduation, the one Earl had missed, that Martha had kept on her dresser. The table was finished 4 days before they were due to arrive. Earl and Dale had carried it into the dining hall, positioned it beneath the chandelier that the Martins had rewired and restored. It sat there, solid and waiting, surrounded by 8 chairs Earl had made to match. Helen had walked around it slowly, running her hand along the smooth surface. "This is beautiful work, Earl. Really beautiful. Thank you. Martha would have loved this." The words hit him hard, as they always did when Martha was mentioned. "I wish she was here to see it." "She is seeing it," Helen had said with certainty. "And she's proud." The final days passed in a blur of last preparations. Dale helped Earl split firewood, stacking it by the fireplace in the main hall. The Martins did a final cleaning, making sure every surface shone. Helen's grandsons arranged the furniture, following Earl's uncertain directions about where things should go, and Earl cooked. 3 days before arrival, he got Martha's recipe box and found the pot roast card. Earl's favorite. Make sure to brown it well first. He likes the crispy edges. He'd gathered the ingredients from the grocery store in town, had asked Helen to check his list to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. Then he'd set up in the kitchen, his kitchen now, with its restored cabinets and the old stove he'd gotten working again, and started to cook. Browning the meat took patience. Getting the vegetables just right took care. The whole process was slower than Earl remembered. His hands not quite as dexterous as they'd once been. But he followed Martha's instructions exactly, could almost hear her voice guiding him through each step. The smell that filled the house was achingly familiar. Sunday dinners. Family gathered. Martha moving between stove and table, her face flushed and happy, children arguing over who got the crispy edges. Earl at the head of the table, taking it all for granted. He'd made it before, over the years since Martha's death. But never with this much care, never with this much at stake. This pot roast wasn't just food. It was a bridge between past and present, a way of saying, I remember, I cherish what we had. I'm trying to build it again. Dale had shown up while the roast was cooking, had been drawn by the smell. Good God, Earl, that smells like heaven. Martha's recipe. You're pulling out all the stops. I don't know what else to do. Earl had leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. What if they come and it's not enough? What if they look at all this and it doesn't matter? Dale had been quiet for a long moment. Then it doesn't matter. You can't control how they'll react, Earl. All you can control is what you offer. And you're offering everything you have, this place, this table, this meal, yourself. That's all anyone can do. What if everything I have isn't enough? Then you learn to live with that and keep trying anyway. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. The day before arrival, Earl walked through the mansion one final time. Each room was ready. Each space held evidence of care, of thought, of a father trying to show love in the language of wood and stone and home-cooked meals. He'd stood in the main hall, looking at the table. Tomorrow, if all went according to plan, his children would sit here. Mark and Karen and Clara would sit here. They'd eat pot roast, made from Martha's recipe, surrounded by walls Earl had rebuilt with his own hands. The photograph of his 3 children hung on the wall. Next to Sarah's drawing of the family holding hands, Earl had added a new frame, the letter Thomas had sent. A reminder that this moment was happening, was real, was the result of months of work and decades of regret finally transmuted into action. Clementine had wandered in, had stood beside him looking at the table. Earl had rested his hand on her neck, drawing comfort from her solid warmth. Tomorrow, he'd said to her, to himself, to the empty room. Tomorrow, we find out if I've changed enough. That night he'd barely slept. He'd lain in his bed, a real bed now, not a sleeping bag on the floor, and listened to the house settle around him. Wind in the eaves, the creak of old wood, the distant sound of Clementine shifting in her stall. This house was alive now, not empty, not dying, but alive with possibility. Tomorrow it would either become a home or remain just a beautiful building. Tomorrow he'd either find his family again or lose them for good. The uncertainty was terrifying. But Earl had learned, over these months of rebuilding, that terror was often a sign you were doing something that mattered. That growth came from taking risks, from being vulnerable, from offering everything you had and accepting that it might not be enough. He'd built the table, he'd prepared the rooms, he'd cooked the pot roast. He'd done the work, internal and external, of becoming someone his children might want to know. Now came the moment of truth. Now came his children, carrying their own scars and hopes and questions. Now came the test of whether Earl McCready, 74 years old and finally learning to be soft as well as strong, had changed enough to deserve a second chance. He rose with the sun on the day they were due to arrive. He dressed carefully in clean clothes, combed his hair, checked his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was older than he felt inside, weathered and worn, but his eyes were clear and his hands were steady. He was as ready as he'd ever be. Now, all he could do was wait. Earl had been standing at the window since dawn, though they weren't expected until mid-morning. His coffee had gone cold in his hand. He'd set it down, picked it up, forgotten about it again. The waiting was physical, a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult. Dale and Helen had arrived early, had positioned themselves as support. They stood in the kitchen, giving Earl space, but staying close enough to help if he needed it. Their presence steadied him, reminded him he wasn't facing this alone. The road stretched empty before the mansion, a ribbon of gravel cutting through the November landscape. The trees were bare now, the grass brown with frost. It was a stark landscape, honest and unadorned. Good weather for truth-telling, Earl thought. At 9:47, movement on the horizon. 3 vehicles, appearing as dark shapes against the pale sky, growing larger as they approached. Earl's heart began hammering, so hard he could hear it in his ears. Dale's hand settled on his shoulder. "Breathe, Earl," he breathed. In, out. Watch the cars grow closer. resolve into rental sedans, middle-sized and practical, the kind of cars you got for a trip you weren't sure would be short or long, good or bad. The cars slowed, turned into the drive. The sound of gravel crunching under tires was impossibly loud in the morning quiet. Earl's hand gripped the window frame, knuckles white. His cane leaned against the wall. Forgotten, the engines cut off one by one. Silence rushed back in, broken only by a crow calling from the bare trees. The first door opened. Sarah emerged, and Earl's breath caught. She was older, of course she was older, 49 now, but seeing her in person after so many years was different than knowing it intellectually. She'd cut her hair short. She wore glasses. She moved with a careful deliberateness that reminded him painfully of Martha in her last years. A man climbed out. From the driver's side, Mark had to be. Tall, greying, the soft-handed boy from town, now a soft-handed man. He put his arm around Sarah's shoulders, protective. She leaned into him slightly. The second car opened. Thomas unfolded from the passenger seat, and Earl almost didn't recognize him. His gentle son had grown a beard, had developed a professorial stoop to his shoulders. A woman emerged from the driver's side, Karen, practical-looking, competent. She took Thomas's hand immediately, the gesture automatic and sweet. The third car, Rebecca, his wild daughter, his bright Rebecca, stepped out, and Earl had to close his eyes for a moment. She looked so much like Martha, it hurt. The same delicate features, the same way of holding her head, and beside her, a child, Clara, dark-haired, wearing a purple jacket, looking around with wide eyes. His granddaughter, 9 years old. Earl had missed her entire life. First words, first steps, first day of school. All of it gone, irretrievable. They stood by their cars, the 6 of them, looking at the mansion. Earl watched them take it in the restored stonework, the new roof, the smoke rising from the chimney, the curtains in the windows. He saw Sarah touch her throat, saw Thomas shake his head slightly, as if in disbelief. Then, as if choreographed, they all turned to look at the front entrance. At the door where Earl stood, visible through the window, the distance between them was maybe 50 yards. It felt like 50 miles. No one moved. Earl couldn't move, his feet rooted to the floor. His children couldn't move, perhaps feeling the same paralysis. The moment stretched out, brittle and fragile. From the barn came a sound that shattered the tension, Clementine's distinctive bray, loud and insistent. The donkey had heard the cars, wanted to investigate, wanted to know what was happening. Clara's face lit up. "Is that a donkey?" Her voice carried across the cold air, clear and delighted. And just like that, the spell broke. Rebecca's hand tightened on her daughter's. "Yes, sweetie, that's a donkey. Can I see it?" Earl found himself moving, his body making decisions his mind was too frozen to make. He opened the front door, stepped out onto the porch he'd rebuilt with his own hands. The November air was cold against his face. "Her name is Clementine," he called out, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "She's friendly. She likes visitors." 6 faces turned toward him fully for the first time. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Thomas straightened slightly, his scholarly stoop disappearing. Rebecca took a step forward, then stopped. Earl gripped the porch railing, needing something solid to hold on to. This was it. This was the moment where everything either began or ended. Sarah spoke first, just one word, but it carried across the distance. "Dad." Not angry, not cold, just acknowledging, seeing him, saying his name. Earl's voice shook when he answered. "I'm sorry." The words he should have said 30 years ago, 20 years ago, at Martha's funeral. "I'm so sorry." Thomas took a step forward. Then Rebecca. Then finally, Sarah. The 3 of them moving together, as if they'd planned it, though Earl could see they hadn't. They were doing this on instinct, on whatever remained of the bond they'd once shared. Mark and Karen stayed by the cars, giving the family space, but Clara tugged on her mother's hand. "Mama, can we see the donkey?" Rebecca laughed, a sound somewhere between tears and joy. "Yes, baby." We can see the donkey. They were walking toward him now. His children. Coming home, or at least coming to see if home was possible. Earl descended the porch steps, his hip protesting but holding. He couldn't stand above them. Looking down, he needed to meet them on level ground. Dale and Helen watched from the doorway, silent witnesses. But Earl barely noticed them. His entire world had narrowed to 3 middle-aged adults walking across the gravel toward him, carrying decades of hurt and hope in equal measure. The ice was cracking. Whether it would break entirely or just shift, Earl didn't know, but they were here. They'd come. That had to count for something. That had to be enough to start. They met in the middle of the yard, between the cars and the house. Sarah reached him first, stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the lines around her eyes, the grey threading through her dark hair, far enough to still have escape if she needed it. "Dad," she said again, and this time it sounded like a question. Earl wanted to reach for her, to pull her into a hug, but he held himself still. Let them set the pace. Let them choose the distance. "Sarah, you look," his voice broke. "You look so much like your mother." She touched her glasses self-consciously. "Mum never needed these." "No, but the way you stand. The way you—" He stopped, unable to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. Thomas arrived next, stopping, beside his sister. "You built all this?" "The photos didn't. It didn't seem real. But seeing it, I had help." Earl gestured toward the house where Dale and Helen stood. "Good people. I couldn't have done it alone." Rebecca was the last to reach them, Clara's hand still in hers. His youngest daughter studied him with eyes that saw too much, understood too much. "Thomas said we're not here to forgive you." "I know. We're here to see if the change is real. If the man who wrote those letters is the same man standing in front of us." Earl nodded, accepting the terms. "That's fair." Clara tugged on Rebecca's hand. "The donkey, Mama." Despite the tension, or maybe because of it, Rebecca smiled. "Dad, this is Clara, your granddaughter." Earl looked down at the child, this person who carried his blood, his family's history, and knew nothing about him. "Hello, Clara. What was he to her? Not Grandpa. Not yet. Maybe never. I'm Earl." Clara considered him seriously. "Are you my mom's dad?" "I am." "Then you're my grandpa." As if it were that simple, as if titles were automatic rather than earned. "I suppose I am," Earl managed. "Would you like to meet Clementine?" "Yes, please." Earl had started toward the barn, Clara walking beside him with complete trust that children give before the world teaches them to be cautious. Behind them, he heard his children talking in low voices, Rebecca's husband introducing himself to Sarah and Thomas, the adults figuring out how to navigate this strange reunion. Clementine greeted Clara with dignified interest, let the child pet her nose, accepted carrots with her usual grace. Earl watched his granddaughter's delight, her easy laughter, and felt something shift in his chest. This was Martha's great-granddaughter in spirit, carrying forward the lightness that Martha had brought to their family. When they returned to the house, the other adults had gravitated to the porch. Mark and Karen had joined Dale and Helen in introductions. Thomas was looking at the restored stonework with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Would you like to see inside?" Earl asked. Sarah exchanged glances with her siblings, then nodded. "Yes, we'd like that." The tour was awkward, Earl pointing out features, while his children followed quietly. But he saw Sarah stop in the main hall, saw her touch the hand-hewn beams he'd preserved, saw Thomas's eyes go to the bookshelves visible through a doorway, saw Rebecca's sharp intake of breath when she spotted her childhood drawing framed on the wall. "You kept it," Rebecca said, moving closer to the drawing. "Mom saved it. In her recipe box. I found it a few months ago." Sarah joined her sister, the two of them looking at the crayon house, the stick-figure family holding hands. "I remember drawing this," Sarah said quietly. I thought we had this." "We should have," Earl said. "That's on me. I should have built this." He gestured at the drawing, at the concept it represented, instead of what I built instead. Thomas had wandered to his prepared room, was standing in the doorway staring at the bookshelves. "Dad, some of these are first editions. I thought you might like them." "I do. I thank you." The words felt enormous, weighted with more than gratitude for books. When they gathered in the dining hall, Earl saw his children really look at the table for the first time, saw them understand what it represented, what it was made from. The mansion's own wood, broken and repurposed, made beautiful again. Helen had set out the pot roast while they'd been touring, had arranged the table with care. The food steamed, filling the room with scent and memory. "This is Mum's recipe," Sarah said, not a question. "Yes." They sat slowly, finding places, Clara between her mother and grandmother. Earl at one end, traditionally the father's place, though he felt he'd forfeited the right to it, but no one objected, so he stayed. For a moment no one spoke. Then Earl, drawing on courage he hadn't known he possessed, said, "Would someone like to say grace?" Thomas cleared his throat. "I will." He reached for Karen's hand, and around the table, hands found other hands. Earl found himself holding Sarah's hand on one side, small and warm, and Clara's on the other, impossibly tiny. Thomas's voice was steady. "For this food, for this family, for second chances we never thought we'd get, we're grateful." "Amen, amen," the table echoed. Earl looked up and saw Martha's vision made real. Not the stick figures from Sarah's drawing, but the actual family, scarred and complicated, gathered and trying. Not perfect, not healed, but present, together, willing to try. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Earl thought, passing the pot roast to his daughter, beginnings were enough. The visit lasted 3 days, though they'd only planned for one. That first night, after dinner, Sarah had asked if there was room for them to stay. Earl had shown them the bedrooms, had watched his children's faces as they recognized the personal touches in each space, the diploma, the books, the photo, the drawing. Rebecca had cried quietly when she saw the framed picture from her graduation, the one Earl had missed. She hadn't said anything, just touched the frame with one finger, her daughter asleep on the bed beside her. Morning of the second day, Earl had been surprised to find Sarah already up, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, looking through Martha's recipe box. She'd looked up when he entered, and for a moment they just stood there, the early light soft through the windows. "I didn't know she saved all of this," Sarah had said finally. "Her whole life in these cards. She saved everything that mattered to her, including my drawing. Especially your drawing." They'd made breakfast together, Sarah instinctively knowing where things should be, moving through the kitchen like she'd lived there for years. The rest of the family had drifted in gradually, drawn by the smell of bacon and coffee. That afternoon, Earl had been working on a section of fence that still needed repair when Clara's brother— No, wait, he'd gotten confused. Clara was Rebecca's daughter, and she was an only child. It was Dale's presence that reminded him the neighbor, suggesting Earl show one of Helen's grandsons how to properly set a fence post. But it was Thomas's son who'd emailed asking to visit next summer. Thomas had mentioned it over breakfast, cautiously, watching Earl's face. "Jake's studying environmental engineering. He's interested in sustainable building practices. I thought if you wouldn't mind—" "I'd be honored," Earl had said, and meant it. Instead, it was Clara who followed him out to the fence line, curious and unafraid. "Can I help, Grandpa Earl?" The title had taken his breath away. "If your mama says, it's okay." Rebecca had nodded permission from the porch, and Earl had found himself teaching a 9-year-old the basics of fence building. The same lessons he'd tried to teach his own children, but without the impatience, without the criticism, without the constant correction that had made learning feel like failure. "Like this?" Clara had asked, and Earl had said exactly like that, even though it wasn't perfect, because perfect didn't matter as much as trying. The second evening, Sarah and Rebecca had cooked together using Martha's recipes, their rhythm in the kitchen easy and practiced. They'd been doing this together, Earl realized. In the years since Martha's death, his daughters had been keeping their mother's traditions alive, sharing meals, staying connected, without him, but connected nonetheless. Thomas had found Earl in the barn that evening, ostensibly to check on Clementine, but really to talk. They'd stood in companionable silence for a while, two men who'd never quite known how to be father and son, learning now in their 70s and 40s. "This place, what you've built here, it's remarkable, Dad. It's just a building." "No," Thomas had been firm. "It's not. It's an apology made physical. It's proof that people can change. He'd stopped, gathered himself. "When Mum was dying, she told me you were a good man who'd forgotten how to be soft. She said she hoped you'd remember before it was too late. I think she'd be proud of what you've remembered." Earl had gripped his cane tighter, the emotions too large for words. On the morning of the third day, they'd gathered again at the table for breakfast. That's when Sarah had made the announcement that changed everything. "We've been talking. We'd like to come back for Christmas, if that's all right with you." Earl had to set down his coffee cup because his hands were shaking. "All of you?" "All of us," Rebecca had confirmed. "And Thomas's kids want to come too. They've been asking to meet their grandpa." "More grandchildren," Thomas had added with a slight smile. "Two of them. Both in their 20s now. One's in graduate school, one's working in Seattle. They've seen the photos Dale sent. They want to see the mansion. They want to meet you." Mark had leaned forward. "We'd need to know how many bedrooms does this place have. We might need to get creative with sleeping arrangements." Earl had looked around the table at his family, his actual family, present and planning a future that included him, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not happiness exactly, but something close, peace, maybe, or hope finally fulfilled. "I'll make it work," he'd said. "However many rooms we need, I'll make it work." The goodbyes had been hard, but not final. Each of his children had hugged him cautiously, briefly, but genuinely. Clara had hugged him without reservation, making him promise to teach her more about Clementine at Christmas, standing with Dale. And Helen, watching the three cars drive away, Earl had felt the weight of the moment. They were leaving, but they were coming back. The distance between them wasn't closed, but it was narrowing. "You did good, Earl," Helen had said, her arm through his. "We did good," he'd corrected. "All of us." That evening, alone again except for Clementine, Earl had sat at his table, the table that had held his family, that would hold them again in a few weeks. He'd pulled out the journal he'd started keeping, had written about the visit, about Clara's laughter and Sarah's tears and Thomas's quiet approval. He'd written about Rebecca seeing her graduation photo, about the moment they'd all held hands for grace, about the knowledge that his grandchildren wanted to meet him. He'd written about Martha, about the faith she'd had that he would change, would find his way to softness, about how she'd been right, even though it had taken him far too long to prove it. The mansion settled around him. In the gathering dark, his home now, built from ruins, filled with possibility. Outside, the land waited for winter, for spring, for all the seasons to come. The fence he and Clara had worked on stood straight and true. The barn held tools and hay and one patient donkey. The bedrooms waited, ready for Christmas, for family, for the future. Earl looked at Sarah's drawing on the wall, at the stick figures holding hands. He'd built what she'd imagined, not perfectly, not easily, but truly. A home, a family, a second chance made real through months of labor and years of regret, finally transformed into action. Some things couldn't be rebuilt the way they were. But sometimes what you built in their place was stronger, more honest, more real. Earl rose slowly, his hip complaining as always, and walked through his home. He turned out lights, checked windows, made sure the fire was banked. The routines of a man preparing for night, for rest, for tomorrow. And tomorrow would come. His children would call, making Christmas plans. Dale would stop by with coffee. Helen would bring food and wisdom in equal measure. The work would continue. There was always more work on a place like this. But tonight, Earl McCready was content. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd taken a broken mansion and made it whole. He'd taken a broken life and begun to mend it. He'd learned that it was never too late to lay down pride and pick up hope instead. He'd learned that home wasn't a place you inherited. It was something you built, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, apology by apology, until finally you'd created something worth coming home to. And his children were coming home. For Christmas, for summer visits, for the slow work of healing. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything.